Welcome back. So today we're going to take a look at something called balanced fill flash. So I'm going to explain balanced fill flash and how to use balanced fill flash outdoors. Now, notice I specify outdoors. Using balanced fill flash indoors is basically the same process. However, it's much more difficult because you have to deal with different color temperatures of different lights. And you basically run into what's called mixed lighting. Trying to make the exposure is one thing, but then understanding how to either gel or being able to tone mixed lighting can be very, very difficult. So today we're just going to be taking a look at balanced fill flash outdoors. Now, for those of you that are watching this video and you're just going to be using a pop-up flash on your camera, most likely that flash is not going to have enough power to accomplish balanced fill flash when it's bright and sunny outside. If it's cloudy, I think you'll be okay. So this flash is really intended for an external flash that you're going to be sliding onto your hot shoe. We're going to take a look at the flash on the hot shoe and the flash off the hot shoe and using it in what's called high-speed sync mode as well. So the first thing we're going to take a look at are just basic button configurations. Now, this is my Canon flash. I will tell you that I don't really usually use an on-camera strobe to do balanced fill flash in photography. I'm using a much larger strobe with something like an umbrella or most likely a softbox. And I'm usually actually shooting it in a manual mode. But I'm going to teach you how to do TTL balanced fill flash today. Now, this flash is a little bit older and yes, it's scuffed up. And I use Canon flashes, Nikon flashes on my Canon camera. And I even have a Godox flash, which I actually like a lot. The first thing that we have here are these four main buttons. And even if the button configuration is different, basically you're going to have a lot of these options on every camera. You just might need to read your manual to find out where they are and which button does what. So this first one is really simple. This first thing is all it does is illuminate this panel so you can see it. Custom functions. So this flash has a whole bunch of custom functions and I actually have some. One is to fire the flash even if it hasn't fully recycled. And then another one was for hooking up an external battery so I could charge it faster than using the internal batteries. There's no real reason to set any custom functions when you're doing this. Next thing that we have is the mode dial, and the mode dial is going to let us switch between the different modes, and we'll go over them on just a second. This next one we're definitely going to use. So this little H with the lightning bolt is called high speed sync. All cameras come with a sync speed, and that is the maximum shutter speed that your camera can sync with your flash. If you want to use a faster shutter speed than highest sync speed on your camera, you need to make sure that this little H is on. And I'm going to explain what it is and how to use it and what the difference is between the normal mode and high speed sync. This next little icon is for rear curtain sync. Rear curtain sync is this. You actually have two shutters, a top shutter and a bottom shutter on your camera. Normally, the flash syncs with the top shutter, but if you want it to sync with the rear of the shutter, it will allow your camera to do that. So I'll explain how this works. Imagine if you had a 5-second long exposure. Normally, when you would take the picture, the flash would go off right as you push the shutter. But if you have a rear curtain sync on, when you press it, it's going to open up the shutter to take the exposure, but the flash isn't going to go off until just before the shutter closes. So instead of being like click flash, it's going to be like click, and then you're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. And just before 5, when the shutter closes, the flash is going to go. So you're going to have it at the beginning or the end. There is no real right or wrong reason. It does change how the photo comes out. But if you're interested in rear curtain sync, that's something you're going to have to kind of try out to use. The next one is zoom. And so this is changing the zoom on your camera. And this is actually helpful. Sometimes you can actually control your zoom to control the distance on your camera. So one thing I'm going to tell you is there's going to be a little camera icon here that pops up, and then you're going to see a little bar here. It actually flashes on my camera. So sometimes when I take the picture, it's on, and sometimes it's not on. I will eventually show you what it looks like here in a second, and then kind of talk about what it does. This has to do with the range, the working range of your flash. You're going to see a little bar here, and depending on what your settings are, you're going to have a working range in which the flash is going to work. And this little button right here is for wireless control. So if you were setting this up to work wirelessly, that's your little button. And on this camera, there's a little flash and a set button. So what I would do is if I wanted to change the zoom, I would hit the zoom, and then I would rotate the dial to change these numbers. And once I got it, I would hit set. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the different modes. The first mode on this camera is called ETTL, which is electronic TTL, or through the lens metering is what this stands for. Through the lens metering works through the meter of your camera, so it's reading the actual light hitting the sensor. It's much more accurate, and most of the time, this is what you're going to see people use. I actually prefer manual over ETTL, but that's just me. There's no real reason to do that. I think ETTL is much easier to learn. Our next mode down here is manual, and you can see the little flash icon popped up here. It's not really doing anything. It's just kind of telling you the rotation of your flash head. And the next thing is power. So if you see 1:1, that's full power, and then it will be half power, quarter power, eighth power, 16th power, 32nd power, 64th power, however much it goes on. So the power goes in actual third stops. So right here, we're seeing -7th. It's actually less than a 32nd power by 2/3 of a stop. And so you'll see this kind of minus and plus a lot on the flash here because all power is in third of stops. Multi. Now, multi isn't something that we're going to be going into, but this is like a stroboscopic mode. So you're going to set, and this is going to change the power and how many times the flash goes off. So it'll be like pop, 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 pop real fast. And so allow you to do this kind of stroboscopic mode, but that's what that stands for. So right now I have my camera on an automatic mode. So right now you see it says zoom. That's because I have a 70 to 200 millimeter zoom lens, and it's automatically reading what the camera is zoomed at and sets that exact same thing in millimeters. So if I'm at 80, it sets this at 80 millimeters. If I go to 100, it's going to set this at 100 millimeters. So I'm getting full coverage. Now I can override this and do this in a manual mode. You can see now I've got manual and I've set it for 35. So even though my camera might be at 200 millimeters, I can switch this and make it 35 millimeters. So I'm shooting a wider angle. Now, why would I want to do this? Well, maybe 200, the flash was actually too powerful and I need to cut down the power. So I'm dispersing that at a wider pattern and it's giving me less power. Now, just like in manual mode, in TTL mode, you can change the ratio here. This now is doing +1/3. First, I think what we need to do is explain what balanced fill flash is. Balanced fill flash, the flash isn't putting out any more light than already is in your situation. If you were to just turn your flash off and get your exposure, and we'll say it's 200 f/800 ISO, and that takes the perfect picture. When you turn your flash on balanced fill flash, and if this number up here was even, so it's just nothing here, your flash is going to put out the exact amount of light that is already available for your camera. And what this is allowing it to do is kind of fill in shadow areas. If you have a lot of strong shadows in photography and you don't want them, you can fill those in with flash. Now, right now we're set at +1/3, so it's actually going to overexpose your situation a little bit. Most of the time, you're never going to see a plus number when you're doing balanced fill flash. You're most likely going to see the opposite, which is a minus number. So we can see right here, we went from +1/3 to +1. Just like before, this goes in third of stops. So now we're at -1. So it's going to put out one stop less light than ambient. All right, so I've hooked my camera up and I've got the flash down so that we're getting my f-stop reading. So right now my f-stop is f11 in my camera. And you're seeing this little bar here. This little bar, and it's in meters. If you don't understand meters, make sure you understand how long a meter is. But this is showing you the working range of your flash. So I can go basically from 1 meter to 9 meters. So if I'm closer than that, the flash is going to overpower the situation. It's going to be too bright. And if I'm at 13 meters, there's not going to be enough power in the flash to cover that area. Now you could increase your millimeters to get the distance to go this way, or you could reduce it to make it wider to make it go this way. But basically it's showing you the working range. Now that I've changed to f5, you see this increased working range. So I'm gone from 3 meters to plus 18. If I make this 14 millimeters, and the way you do this on the flash is there's actually a diffuser panel that you can pull out and stick over the flash. So if you want to pretty much go, I think 35 might be the max on this camera, but if I pull out that diffusion panel, it's going to allow me to get to 14 millimeters. And so what the 14 millimeters is going to do is allow me to get wider pattern than I did before. So you can see here now, look at the change. I went F5. Remember, it was from 3 meters to like plus 18. But if I put that diffusion panel down, the same thing is now between 0.7 and 2 meters. So a huge difference by putting that diffusion panel down on your camera. These are all important factors to know when you're trying to work your flash. You need to pay attention to where that is, because just because you can use the flash doesn't mean the flash is going to work. I see a lot of people with their little pop-up flash and they have their camera set to ISO 100 and they're trying to take a picture of their kid in a play and they're like 100 yards away. Well, that flash isn't going to travel more than like 5 or 6 feet, let alone, you know, the 100 or 1,000 feet away the kid is. So this is basically how you read the back of your flash. Now, the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you how flash works. Because what happens when you have high-speed sync, and I didn't take a picture here with high-speed sync up, I just forgot. But basically, you're going to see this little H in here or maybe up here, somewhere around here kind of pop up. And this is for when you're shooting high-speed sync. But to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to switch on over to an image in Photoshop, and I will show you how this works. All right, we're back. And so we are in Photoshop just because it's easy for me to kind of explain how this works. On a camera, you actually have 2 shutters, kind of a top and a bottom. And this is the way it works. So right here, let's assume that this picture is our sensor on our camera. And this is the image it's going to take. And when your shutter is closed, it's going to obviously be blocking your sensor. So no light can hit the sensor at this point. So the way the camera works is when you press the shutter, the first part of the shutter moves up. Now that top shutter has cleared the top of this image, now the camera's going to be able to take the picture, and then the second part of the shutter is going to come up and then cover that picture like this, so it's hidden. So that's how it works. There's a top shutter and a bottom part of the shutter. So the top one's going to go up, and then when it clears, it's going to take the picture, and then the bottom shutter is going to come up. So what we're going to do is turn that off. I'm going to turn on this one. The problem with high-speed sync is as you increase your shutter speed, what happens is when the top shutter is moving, so is the bottom shutter. So you kind of only have a slit. So what happens is this moves, now the camera starts, this moves really fast. And basically what happens, the area that is showing is taking the picture. So as this moves across, it's taking the picture. But there's always going to be the top and the bottom shutter in the image. So at any point, if your flash goes off, this is going to be the only area that's going to be illuminated because the flash duration isn't really long. What a camera has to do in high speed sync is it has to flash multiple times. So as this is moving across, your flash is going off. So it's going like pop, 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 and then it fully illuminates the whole image. And that's how high speed sync works. But the problem with this is because high speed sync has to have the flash go off multiple times, you dramatically reduce the power of the flash. So before, remember, we saw like it could go to a max distance of, let's say, 16 meters. Well, it's never going to be able to cover that 16 meters in high speed sync because you don't have enough power. And people are going to be like, well, there's multiple reasons that you'd want to do high speed sync. And the main one for me usually ends up because I want to shoot at a shallower depth of field. Then I don't want to take a portrait and have it be at f11. Maybe I want to be at 5 or f4. So high speed sync offers me that option. And when you do daylight balance fill flash, if you're shooting at 1/60th, you've got to be very careful, especially with long focal length lenses, because you can get a little bit of motion blur, especially with the quality of images today. Flash does stop action, but remember, our subject isn't in complete darkness. They're actually in daylight, and this is just a fill. If your flash was the only light source, it would completely stop your action, even at 60th of a second. But since it's not, you tend to get a little bit of motion blur. I actually prefer to shoot high speed sync when I'm doing this because it solves that issue. And you look at someone's eyes and they're never like perfectly sharp, and that's because you've got a little bit of motion blur. So that's how high speed sync and flash work on your camera. All right, so the bottom part of this is got my exposure, so you can see my shutter speed is at 160. This flash actually does sync at 200th of a second, but what happens on the edge, it gets a little dark usually on the edge, so I tend to like 160, it just comes out better. Our f-stop is f9, and we are at ISO 100, and there is no flash. I took this photo very specific. I shot this at high noon. It was like 98 degrees outside, so horrible light. So you can see as the light's coming down, we're getting these nasty, harsh shadows on someone's faces. And I'm sure some of you have heard, no, you should never take a portrait at high noon. Well, you can do it. You need to do a good job with using fill flash, and it obviously it helps to use a light modifier as well. But I'm showing you this image, and I shot this at a particularly horrible time of day, so you can really see how the fill flash is working and what it's doing. Remember, the exposure is just your normal exposure. So when you set it up, you want just a normal exposure. So if you were to take the picture would come out fine. So notice that our background looks good in this. What fill flash is doing is just here to fill in the shadow areas and midtones of an image, depending on how much light output you have. You know, we're not trying to overexpose the highlights anymore. Well, why? Because it's balanced fill flash. It's usually only putting out as much light as your ambient. It's not going to overexpose your highlights. It's just filling in the midtones and shadows. That's the goal of balanced fill flash most of the time. So what we're going to do next is we're going to go over here with the flash on the camera. All right, so here is the next image. And in this one, we have the flash minus 1/3. So it's not even, it's minus 1/3. I tend to like minus 1/3 better than even. Even totally usually washes the image completely out. But remember those harsh shadows that we have here? No, we still have some shadows. And remember, all these photos are not edited. These are raw, straight out of the camera. I haven't done anything to them. And that's so you can see what the flash is doing. So you can see how that flash is really filled in the shadow areas. So the goal of fill flash is to dial your flash to achieve the perfect balance for whatever you're looking for. Obviously, if you're shooting on a shady day, you don't need as much fill flash because all you're trying to really do is just give a little more pop to the dark shadow areas. And in a really contrasty day like this, we're going to end up having to probably use more flash because we have such harsh, nasty shadows. Really, you should do your best to try to avoid that, and that will solve a lot of the problem. But in this case, and a lot of times you're just out taking photos and the situation is the situation, and you just need to get the best possible outcome for whatever that situation is. And so this case, we're going to have to be adding a little bit more flash. All right, so this is going to be the next image. And notice now the flash is at -1. Before we were at minus 1/3. So now we're at -1. And it's still filling in the midtone and shadow areas, but not quite as much. We're having still have this really hard shadow right here over the eye. Basically, the eyebrow is blocking the light and creating this harsh shadow under here. But this is still working good. It's not overpowering the image. You know, you're not trying to make this look fake. You're just trying to fill in. And you can see right here in the eye, there's two little dots. That's definitely telling you that we use fill flash in this image when you can see that light in the eye. Go to the next image. Right here, now we've got -2. So we're 2 stops under ambient. It's still filling in the shadow area, but not quite as much as it did before. And you can go all the way to plus or -3 on most flashes. So here, notice we can tell we still got a flash going on because we can see the light in the eye, but it's just barely filling in the shadow areas just a little bit. And this is a great option when you're shooting in the shade, having like almost a -3 flash. It's just adding a little bit. You almost can't tell that the flash is going off, but it is helping the overall image a little bit. But in a situation like this where we have some really strong, nasty shadows, -3 is just not even close to enough flash. Now, one of the things I've told you is that I'm not adjusting the image at all. So what I did here is I took the flash with -1, and then I took that same one and I just made some basic global adjustments in Adobe Camera Raw. I did not do any spot toning. All I did was kind of flatten the image out a little bit and open up the shadows. So the transition between the highlight and the shadow is closer. So it's a smoother transition from here to here. And this is going to allow me to kind of open this area and even everything out. I can add the contrast back later, but this is allowing me to kind of smooth out those skin tones. Between bright and shadow is a strong jump here. And if you look here, it's a much softer jump. We're going to be able to even out that facial tone and then actually increase the contrast and tone the image later. So the next slide we're going to take a look at here is hard light versus soft light. The issue with shooting outside when the sun is way up in the sky and very bright is what we have is a hard light. And that hard light is really easy to see because you have this really strong shadow with a hard edge. A soft light might give you a shadow, but it's going to be a gradual transition. A soft light is usually a large source close to your subject. And a hard light can be either a large source or a small source, it doesn't really matter, but it's a long ways from your subject. So a hard light is creating a harsh shadow and a soft light is creating a soft shadow. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look real quick at some hard light and some soft light examples so you kind of get an idea of what the difference is between the two. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to kind of take some of that harshness out of a hard light. And that's what you're trying to achieve with fill flash. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to sort of explain the difference between hard light and soft light. But this is a great image of fill flash. What they actually did with this fill flash is they actually stopped down the ambient exposure so it would actually come out dark, and then they filled in with a little more flash, most likely using a strobe to get this effect. And I'll explain how that's done in a little bit. But we're going to take a look at hard light versus soft light. Now, this is definitely more of, it's not a perfectly soft light, but it's not a hard light. So it's a slow transition in the light or the shadows. So if we took a look at this image, one of the things that is confusing for people is directional light. So directional light can be hard or soft. There's flat light, usually flat light, the flash is coming straight onto the subject instead of at an angle. Now, soft light is easy to see because you're going to have a slow transition from bright to dark, and you're going to have a really strong, sharp edge in hard light. In soft light, it's going to be very gradual. Now, in this image, we actually have two lights. So we have a light coming here and a light coming here. And these lights aren't really hard or soft. It's almost in between. So we're getting an edge, but it's a soft edge. So if you look at this image, it's a directional light, but look here on our nose. See how that's just a sharp edge on the shadow? That's saying to us, hey, this is a hard light. It's a directional light, but it's also a hard light. Now, if we look at this image, notice we have a directional light, but this is actually a softer light. See how that transition kind of blends out and the shadow wraps around the face slowly? What this is showing you is that this is a soft light, but a directional. And a lot of people might mistake this as a hard light because it's bright on this side and darker on this side, but it's just how the light was used. So if we look here again, once again, this is closer to a soft light because look at the transition of the shadow on the nose. It's very gradual. It's not the world's softest light. It's not a super hard light, but it's also not casting weird shadows. Normally, if this was a hard light, you would actually see the rim of his glasses with a shadow over here on the edge. That gives you just kind of a brief understanding of the difference between a hard light and a soft light. And here's just a great image of what you can achieve using fill flash outdoors. Now for the last shot, we had the subject out in the sunlight. Now what I did is I took the subject and I moved her into the shade. A lot of people, if they're in bright sunlight, are going to squint or have difficult time seeing. So it's one of the first things you need to find out when you're actually taking images outdoors is how sensitive people are to sunlight. Now I move the subject into the shade. What this is going to do is a couple of things. First of all, it's going to make it cooler for the person when it's 96 degrees outside. It's going to make them not squint in the sun. And when we use fill flash, it's going to create a more even tone on the face because we don't have this nasty, harsh shadow under the eye. If I was to just leave my exposure like I did before, that 160 f9 at 100, my image would come out totally dark. One option I can do, and this image are taken in the same spot, is I can change my exposure so my exposure is now for the ambient light in the shade. Now what that's going to do is blow out the background, which is okay. There's no right or wrong area. So we can blow it out, but you'll get this sort of washed out look in someone's face. When you have a situation where something is backlit and you open up the exposure here, it's going to wash that out. There's nothing wrong with that. And there's a few different ways to kind of tackle it. Then what I did is I went back to this exposure and this exposure are now exactly the same. So this base exposure on my camera, so it's 160 f9 at f100. So the ambient light in the background is the same. And I filled in with -3rd. Now you're going to notice when you start to do this, you really can't go -1 because it ends up having your subject be too dark. Because remember, the ambient light isn't hitting our subject anymore. So the only light that our subject is getting illuminated with is actually the flash. So you're going to have to output more flash to illuminate your subject. I also move my flash from on camera to off camera. And it's really easy to see. So you can tell it's over here to the left because now we're creating a shadow with this image. Now that's the first reason I usually shoot fill flash off camera, but I use a softbox because that will help eliminate this shadow cast right here. But you could always still have your camera on direct and then you wouldn't see this shadow. But for right now, that's what we're going to do. You can see there's a little shadow here, a little shadow here. We have no flash in the shade. Ambient, where I'm changing the exposure, or I can go back to my ambient so my background is illuminated correctly. And then we're filling in with flash. Notice we're not getting any of those harsh shadows from the ambient light on the face now because we are in shade. This is just a quick image that I did. So this is the same image in the shade. If I took it and then here's the 1/3 of fill flash with just a basic simple tone. And you can see how clean this image has become. There's hair in there because it's a little bit windy and the dog looks stupid because we don't know what the dog was doing. But this is really just a tutorial on how to use fill flash and like what it can do with you as far as photography. So the next thing I have here is a series of 3 images. And these are when the subject was in the shade. And so I'm trying to show you the difference in power. Remember I said you need more power when you shoot in the shade because your subject will get too dark. This is the person in no flash. This is with 2/3. Now the one I ended up using was with -1/3, but this is -2/3 and -1. So you can see how dark and muddy the image starts to get. If you do have your subject in shade, you're going to definitely need more power. So earlier I talked about high-speed sync. And when you use high-speed sync, one of the issues that can be caused is it doesn't have as much power as when you use a traditional sync. So what I did here is I took my subject and I put my exposure so it was at 160 and I took a picture. And the only thing I changed was I changed the camera to high-speed sync and I changed my exposure. So I probably lowered my aperture and raised my shutter speed. So I'd be shooting at high-speed sync and I went off. And you can see, and my subject didn't get as illuminated as it did here with the flash. Well, why? Because it just didn't have enough power at that point to illuminate my subject from the distance I was to him, which was about 15 feet. Now, the last thing that we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this image. And one of the cool things that you can do, and this works really well with the softbox, we just saw that picture of that model and the background was really dark, but she was illuminated from the side. This is how you do that. This was my image where I have my exposure at 160 f9 at ISO 100 and I take an exposure. What you can do is purposely darken your ambient picture. So what I can do here is I can change my exposure and I can do it by either moving my shutter speed or my f-stop, or you could actually move your ISO. So you want to make your ambient exposure a little darker. So I can go from 160 to 250. Now, when I do that, I need to put on high-speed sync. But let's say that everything is going to work fine. So I put it in. What's good that's going to do? It's going to make my background darker. So this is what this image would look like normal with an ambient being correctly exposed. And now you can see how much muddier or darker this image is. Now in this situation, once again, my flash isn't powerful enough to illuminate my subject. This is most likely why you'll see me using a larger strobe outdoors, a light modifier. The light modifier is going to give a more pleasing light and it's going to be able to actually fill in this situation. So the way that you make a background darker is to actually take and make your exposure a little bit dark, and then you're going to fill in with your flash. So we're back at this image, and remember, we're stopping down to make the ambient dark, but then we're filling in with the flash with the correct exposure. So our subject is exposed correctly, but our background is dark. So the way that you would do this is if this exposure, once again, was 160 f9 at ISO 100, then you would move your, let's say we'll move our shutter speed. Well, in this case, let's say we don't have high speed sync. We'll move our f-stop from f9 to f11. That's going to darken this down, and you can darken it down as much. And then you're going to fill in with your flash. So your flash is at the f11. So it's going to put out more light than is in your ambient. And that's what's going to give you this look using fill flash. Now, this is something that I do a lot. And this is why I actually prefer using off-camera strobe, just because you can get a more dramatic and pleasing light. Usually when you light a subject straight on, it's a little bit flat. It doesn't look quite as good as a nice soft side light. Well, that's a little bit on how to use balanced fill flash on your DSLR or mirrorless camera. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave those below. And as always, don't forget to subscribe.